everybody. Welcome to another round of People of Good News. This morning we got Dr. Leroy Graham with us. And Leroy and his wife, Pat, you've probably seen them if you've been at Good News much. They're often at the front doors greeting and welcoming everybody in. And we've been so glad to have them as a part of our church family and just been such a great addition to us. And so we're so glad that you're here with us, Leroy. And so quick question. Why don't we start off with this? Why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure, Pastor Brad. I'm a native of Chicago on the south side. Went to Catholic schools from grade school through high school, through college and medical school. And basically, when I got to medical school, it was obvious that I couldn't pay for it and I didn't want to go into debt. So I took an Army scholarship and did my basic pediatric training in the Army. The Army then sent me to Korea and did some time over there, came back from there and went to Fort Knox as a pediatrician, and then decided I wanted to specialize in pulmonary and critical care. So the Army allowed me to go to University of Colorado, where I completed a fellowship there. During my residency in pediatrics, Patrice and I met. She was a pediatric resident. She was actually my intern, which was the last time I got to be in charge. And that's not a joke either. And subsequent to that, I came back, shortly started a pediatric intensive care unit at the Army hospital out in Denver, and everything was great. And then Desert Storm came along, and I was given a lecture in Washington, D.C., and my wife called me and says, you got to get back here pretty quick. I think you're going to Desert Storm. So I wound up being what's called a brigade surgeon, which is a head medical officer in a 2,000-man brigade. In my case, that was the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Infantry Division. Thought that I'd kind of be in the back of that somewhere, and found out that I was with one of the 1st brigades in the 1st Division that actually went into Desert Storm. And as you know, things went very, very well for us. And I spent most of my time taking care of Iraqi casualties, a few American casualties, and then kind of back to my cushy life in Colorado. I'd kind of decided with a family now that maybe the Army and going to war wasn't in the best interest. So I planned to get out, and to get out even before I was retired. And I got a physical as I was getting out, and turned out the young doctor that was seeing me heard a heart murmur, and I had a huge aortic aneurysm and a leaking aortic valve. That was nothing short of God, because I had run 3 or 4 miles that day. I was fortunate to go to Stanford University, get one of the world-class guys to fix me, and then went on to private practice. In 2014, pastor of the church I belonged to asked me to start a nonprofit, a charitable health center that uniquely would provide specialty care. Got together with some of my adult and pediatric specialists, and we founded Bridge Atlanta Medical Center, which is now part of Good Samaritan. Did that for 2 or 3 years, and then decided that this place we had down here in Sandestin would make a great home. You know, I've been so blessed in so many ways, and kind of how I really came to Christ, or a personal relationship with Christ.
Well, that's awesome. We love having you here. Let me ask you, so let's go back to the start. You said your mom, who I know just recently passed away, and talk a little bit about her and growing up in South Side of Chicago. It must have been tough having to be a Sox fan.
I was a Cub fan.
Okay, good.
I was a traitor. Well, you know, my parents actually divorced when I was about 4.5, 5 years old. So for quite a long season, my mother raised me largely as a single parent, and she did that without, or well, let's say, inconsistent help from my father for a season. And she was one of the strongest people I ever met in my life. I mean, she was a woman with a high school education that made it all the way to division level management in a telephone company when she retired in Illinois Bell. She's a strong woman, a woman steeped in faith. And basically when we got down here, probably in around 2017, on a visit to Chicago, it became apparent that Mom, who had taken care of me so well, needed some taken care of. She had an accident, kind of confabulated the whole thing about a car wreck. And it was clear she had to come down. So we brought her down initially to Atlanta on a kind of a vacation, and then kind of slid her down here, and she turned to us and said, I'm not going back to Chicago, am I? I go, no, Mom, you're not. So she lived with us for about a year and a half, and then we found Brookdale over at Sandestin. That was a good place for her. She really blossomed there. She had a lot of peers. She's always a cut up. She kept people laughing. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, last November, this past November, while I was out riding my bike, wife told me I needed to come to Sacred Heart right away. And they found her deceased that morning, worked on her to no avail. And she was pronounced dead over at Sacred Heart. And knowing my mom, she had completely planned her Catholic funeral. And I mean, written it out in great detail. And I found her old pastor, and we took her back to Chicago, and she's buried out in the south suburbs next to the rest of her family.
What was school like for you, leaving Chicago, going to Philadelphia, even spending some time at, I think you said med school was at Georgetown, right?
Right. My mom was pretty strict. I wasn't a wild guy, but I got to college and I kind of went wild, not in a bad way. I mean, did good grades, but I did a lot of the kind of things people did in the 70s, and probably distanced myself, I think, from the Lord during that period. I'd occasionally go to mass down in the student center, and I didn't do anything terrible, but I think that was a part of my life where I was kind of like, I'm good, God, and I kind of went on about my business. One thing that was very good about that is it took me to see a much more diverse group of people up close, living in dormitories and things like that. My high school in Chicago was predominantly white, but I didn't live with the people. So a lot of things about maturing about the way I look at race and maybe helping other people look at that really was a big part of my education. So maybe when I was not too close to God, God was still close to me, because I think a lot of the way I look at life and look at disparities and look at differences were really formed in that crucible.
Well, when you talk about that race for a second, why don't you talk about that just a little more, about helping people see that? Like, what's that like, even just in our area?
Well, in our area, I don't see a whole lot of people of color. I go over to the air base because I can, and I shop over there and things like that. I'm seeing more and more as I get to know people who don't live on a nice place like Sandestin and getting a little bit out in the community. And I think what I found is, I think in the South, as opposed to the North, the South has really gone through the process of integration. It was kind of de facto in the North. And I got to be honest with you, when I started thinking about living down here on what, somebody had called the Redneck Riviera, I had some apprehensions. But I got to tell you, the three years or so that we've been down here, I think I haven't had any real problems. And I think that's part my maturation, but I think also the people that I've met down here. And I think maybe this is kind of a unique kind of place. Maybe there's our problems, but it hasn't been a big problem, because Pat and I have met people at Good News and other places on a personal level. And I don't think we see color the same way, and people don't seem to make a big deal of us. Yeah. I suspect people that it bothers to, they don't stay in my sphere of awareness, so it's okay. My son is down here now too. He is a shameless plug. He is a trainer for What's Up Dog, quite a good one. Being a young black male, I think he's still kind of going through some of the challenges on occasion that I have, but he's adjusting pretty well.
When you were in Desert Storm, talking about that, I mean, and you talk about that revival and just kind of encountering God in that. I mean, there's a challenge there.
It was strange because we were, when the Army goes to war, they do like predictive battle assessments or battle casualty things. And I was in a brigade in a division that was going to be the first one in. So, it was supposed to be really bleak. We were supposed to be what they call combat ineffective 12 hours into the battle, which means that 40% of our personnel force would be incapacitated, not necessarily killed, but between equipment and injury, we'd be out of the game, and we were just supposed to open up the hole and everybody else goes through us. So I had a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety there. And like I said, I casually started reading the Bible, but these young soldiers behind me, I'd hear them praying, and I had never had an experience of praying in the Spirit. And I didn't know what it was. It was kind of scary at first. But as I got with them, and as I, heard all the things that were going to happen, I went into the Desert Storm as part of a frontline unit with a sense of peace. I was pretty sure that I was going to survive, and I knew if I didn't, I was going to go to a good place. The interesting thing is that there were so many Iraqi casualties, and our soldiers, Christians and otherwise, basically did what soldiers do after a battle. And they cared about the Iraqi soldiers who were just devastated because they were fellow soldiers. Mm-hmm. And I spent more time after we went through the breach taking care of Iraqis. And it impressed me. Some of these same soldiers who had been praying out in back of my tent demonstrated Christianity on an incredible level. I mean, we were supposed to get our butts handed to us by these guys, but it was a rout, and they really cared about them. I mean, the Geneva Convention about giving aid to the enemy when they're injured, I mean, I really saw it in action, and I prefer to think that was faith-led, you know, because I saw some incredible things. In fact, one vignette I tell people is we were in a place where we really had a lot of Iraqi casualties. I mean, we had like 100 to several hundred Iraqis that had been taken prisoner, and a lot of them were really in bad shape. And we had Syrians. I don't know if you remember, Syria was actually our ally then, and they spoke Farsi like the Iraqis did. And an interpreter came to me with a tattered white flag, and instead of a red cross, he had a red crescent. And I'm like, okay, dude, what's this all about? And he says, well, this is like your Red Cross. And I go, yeah, and what? And he says, well, I think somewhere along the line, we probably overran an Iraqi army field hospital or something. So being an American and using ingenuity, and I said, well, that means maybe in all those 1,000 or so people over there, you can find me a couple of Iraqi doctors. And he said, well, I'll see. And they did. He sure did. And he found a couple of Iraqi medics, several Iraqi medics and things. And we spent about 3 days just taking care of Iraqis. Did some kind of meatball kind of repair surgery and stuff until we could evac them to, you know, army facilities. Wow. And I was touched by the amazement that some of the Iraqi physicians and medics had. They couldn't believe that we would render care for them. But that's, you know, after the battle's over, that's always been a characteristic of the U.S. military. You know, you have this Geneva Convention, means that you'll render, you know, once the hostility's over, you render aid and comfort, you know. It was also, you know, didn't know much about Islam there. And, you know, one of the amazing things, we stopped near a place called Ur. And if you remember in the Bible, Ur is where Abraham's house was supposed to be. And the Iraqis had actually turned it into a bit of an amusement area. They made a pier that looked like what his pier would have been on the banks of the Euphrates. And I'm told, though I didn't get to really see it, that when they flew over that area, there was like this perfect circle around there where there was no destruction. And a crusty old colonel, I said, well, what do you think about that? And he says, well, you know, B-52s don't really bomb like that. And I said, well, what's your explanation? He says, well, you believe in God, you believe in the Bible, maybe that was it. So I never really got to see that, but the visual he gave me was that somehow in the midst of all this, in the middle of Iraq, which is probably where Abraham was, right on the dry riverbed that time of year of the Euphrates, was this like perfect circle where there was no destruction. And then we got to be actually where the ceasefire was signed in Safwan, Iraq. We got to be the medical and security support. So I got to meet Schwarzkopf and things like that very briefly. He wouldn't know me from Adam, but you know, I was just really impressed with our military. It just seemed to me that things worked the way they were supposed to. And on a personal level, you know, I think I found God.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, tell me about, so when you came back, obviously, you know, you have this experience with God, and you come back, that shapes your ministry, that shapes your life and how you live. So what were some things that changed with you in terms of medicine and how you cared for people and just your life?
Well, I came back to, when I got out, I was at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, which is a very big and very good children's hospital. And I had always tried to render comfort to patients and families, because a lot of times I would be doing consults in the intensive care unit or doing bronchoscopy, looking down into the lungs of children that were on a respirator or had different kinds of pulmonary problems. And sometimes I'd actually participate in counseling a family that we had reached a useless point, and why they might want to consider withdrawing support. And I had started, that was about the time we had joined Victory World Church, and I'd started reading the Bible for the first time. And there was a verse that stood out in Philippians 4:6-7, about do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, with prayer and petition, bring a request to God, whose peace surpasses all understanding, and he'll guide your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. And that was a big verse for me, and it remains a big verse. But that came to me from a patient encounter, okay? And I was counseling a mom, and you know, I was willing to pray with her, and I kind of awkwardly said, you know, I know we doctors don't often pray with them. And I said, she says, well, you know, if you believe what you believe, you know, I've got a doctor who's in charge of all of this. And it just put chills up my back, you know? Yeah. So I got a reputation. along with a few other doctors, for being willing to pray with patients in the ICU. So much so that one of my best friends, who's fabulous intensive care doctor, actually retired down here as well. He like me had been raised Catholic, but wasn't really into faith. So he used to call me. He said, Leroy, we got this kid that I think it's hopeless, and we're gonna have to take him off the ventilator, and I need you to do that God talk. And I kind of resented that, and I said, well, there's no magic here. I just want to go and pray with them. And a lot of times, I'd go in there, and I kind of help people see that they could make a decision to let go if that was the case, or they could continue to pray. It was their option. And I got to tell you, on both ends, I saw people come to peace with things that really were hopeless. But I also saw something that I think I'd call miracles.
One of my favorite quotes is from a guy named Philip Yancey. And he says that grace is like water and that it always flows to the lowest point.
Wow. I like that.
And I think for you, hearing about your story in war and in the midst of these just unfathomable situations with family going through the most difficult things ever, to see God so active in those places is such a testament to the reality that God's everywhere in this with us, right?
That's true.
And so
I would agree.
In your nonprofit as well, I think you probably saw some of that. What was that like, and some of the work you did there?
Yeah, well, we formed, along with some other friends, we formed something called Not One More Life, and that was to kind of address health disparities, the difference that certain races, and it's probably more social determinants than race, poor people in general don't necessarily get access to the best possible health care, and they often have, it's complicated by low health literacy. So a couple of pastors and a couple of people, we thought, well, maybe what we ought to do is do education and healthcare screening, particularly in the context of asthma, which is really bad in children, and particularly bad in African-American, Hispanic children, and poor white children. So we started doing these programs where we'd go out to communities of faith, and we'd go there with the endorsement of the pastor, and we'd screen these people with lung function testing, portable testing, where we test their lungs like anybody that has COPD or asthma is probably very familiar with. And then we'd also give them some education about what it meant. We'd also talk to them about their therapy, and in a non-threatening fashion, we'd either get them into specialists if they need it, or we would basically write letters to the doctors that they had suggesting things. And that was fairly well received. And we got a big grant at one point from Children's. We did this in a lot of the public schools in Atlanta. And that was pretty exciting because a lot of people got to see the exposure. Yeah. Then we started, shortly before I came down here, we started going around the country teaching other pulmonary groups and other medical teams to do it. And we've done replications throughout the country. And we're now, the scalability has been greatly enhanced by, we're now a member or we're a component of the Allergy and Asthma Network of American Mothers of Asthmatics. And they kind of bankroll those. And I still sometimes travel with them when they go to other cities. But it was kind of a nice merge of health and faith, because people in the inner city, poor people in general, sometimes are distrustful of the medical establishment because they haven't had really good experiences. But we found that when we partnered with a faith community, or even a school, but more so the faith community, that gave us validation far beyond the color of my skin. So it was kind of like, well, if Pastor Jones says I need to come get tested, I'm coming to get tested. And that was a powerful thing. And I think in the Black church in particular, from before integration, when maybe Blacks could not get the kind of health care, I mean, there's still problems there, but the church was where people went when things were down. If somebody got put out of their house, somebody was sick, somebody needed money for prescriptions and so forth, and that still continues. So the Black pastors were the first to embrace it. But as we moved out of that, we found that most clergy, are really into that, because that is still where people go when things are bad. They turn to their church, they turn to their pastors.
So we've been wrapping these up with some kind of rapid fire questions. So I'm going to shoot some at you. All right.
Okay, cool.
What's the book you've given away the most in your life?
Jesus Calling by Sarah Hart.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
What about a movie we should watch during the quarantine?
Pat, what's the movie with about the prison?
Shawshank?
No. Shawshank Redemption. Shawshank Redemption.
That's a classic. That's good.
That's a classic. Then another movie that's just kind of cool. It's not necessarily as heavy as there's a movie called Self-Made. Okay. That's a movie with Olivia, whatever her name is, but it's about Madam C.J. Walker, who was a first to everybody's knowledge, first black female millionaire in
Oh,
hair
wow.
products. That's a cool story. So
Yeah,
that's
I've
a good
seen that on
movie. I
Netflix.
like.
That's cool.
Those are probably two of my favorites, and you know, I think that's a good thing to get into some good movies and so forth like that.
Well,
I'll
what
tell you
about
one that's kind of funny. It's not, it may be a little profane, but Barbershop, which is
Oh.
a movie that we watched last night for probably the 10th time. That's pretty good. We also are doing some reading. Another book that I'd recommend is
yeah.
it's a book called The Warmth of Other Suns, which is about the Black migration from the South to the North.
Yeah.
It's a long book. It takes about 5 different characters and goes from leaving, you know, really bad situation in the South. In fact, one of them not too far from here in Central Florida in the orange groves, and people that just came up to the Midwest and the East to have a different life. And interesting enough, it's a very honest story, because while it was a step up, it was another set of problems and how these people grew and dealt with them. And there's a lot about faith in it and so forth. So it's about 600 pages, but it's a great read. It's Warmth of Other Suns. It was a Pulitzer Prize winner in 2010.
Oh, that's cool. What about where are you going to eat after this quarantine?
Cafe 30A. Probably. Where else we're going to go, Pat? Ocean Club. That's our favorite place, the Ocean Club. Yeah, we're kind of on the older set. We kind of like that. It's kind of fun to sit on. I married a girl from New Orleans, so don't worry about us right now. I'm eating just fine.
Okay, so I'm gonna put you on the spot with this one. I didn't tell you I was gonna ask you this one. So it's quarantine. You got the New Orleans. If we just had to have some good jazz music playing over dinner tonight, who we listen to?
Ooh. Let's see. Donald Byrd would be a good one. Joe Sample. Joe Sample is an incredible black pianist. Also moving more, we get into a lot of the kind of modern jazz or smooth jazz, almost anything by Brian Culbertson.
All right.
It's just awesome. Good. A little bit of Boney James thrown in if you're getting in a romantic mood. Yeah. That would be stuff I'd listen to. You can always hit me up on music, man.
That's good. All right. So what's a scripture you go to most?
Well, Philippians 4:6-7.
Yeah, that's good.
That's my memory verse. That's my go-to verse. I've done that a lot in the last few weeks and so forth. And I really believe that times like this, you know, when you can't make sense of it, that's the only place ultimately you can go for comfort.
That's right.
I mean, I can tell you all the things about why we should be social distancing, but I got to tell you, even with all my knowledge, I'm probably as anxious as everybody that's going to see this, you know?
Yeah.
And I think we just have to trust in God. We got to listen to what people tell us about social distancing. I'm a news junkie, and my wife's really making me fast that because, you know, it just stirs you up. I would just tell people every morning, if you want to know, go to the Florida Department of Health and go to the CDC website. That will give you the totals. We need to really stay close to the home. That 6-foot thing is real. But without me going through that, if you just go on the CDC, www.cdc.gov, there is a wealth of information written not for doctors, but for people. And you just got to do that. You got to stay prayed up. We're going to get through this. We are going to get through this.
Man. Well, good. Well, dude, thanks so much for taking a little time with me this afternoon. I know you got stuff to do, but
man.
To just hear from you and to get to know you. And like we said, our hope with these is when we get back to church, everybody knows each other a little bit better from all this.
Well, my wife would say you let me do the thing I like to do most, and that's talk. So she didn't have to listen to me for this time, so it's kind of cool. But anyway, thank you so much for the opportunity, and just know that Patrice and I, we love good news, and it was just so important we found a church home here, and we can't thank you enough.
Well, thanks so much, Leroy. I appreciate it.